Hey everyone, I'm back again with another video. So today we're going to talk about a topic that I think doesn't get enough attention, and it has to do with the fact that Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck building has greatly changed over the years. I know this may sound trivial, but it's an interesting topic that I think partially explains why the game is the way it is today, and it might give some valuable insight to people who are looking to make it in the modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! Scene. I'll also talk about the small ways deck building has changed, but I'll mainly be focusing on the old school traditional deck building theme and comparing it to how it's changed today. But before I start, feel free to like, comment, and share this video, and feel free to check out my other videos and do the same. And feel free to subscribe if you really like my content. But without any further ado, let's get into it. So, what do I mean by traditional deck building? What I mean is the traditional ratio of 20 monsters, 10 spells, and 10 traps. This ratio was pretty much like the Yu-Gi-Oh! Gold standard for building decks. And this is the deck building philosophy that I was introduced to when I got into Yu-Gi-Oh! This ratio was the ratio that all players greatly adhered to back in the day, and this was really helpful for beginners too, since it helped give a sort of template for how you were supposed to build a deck. And it was certainly helpful for me. I remember not knowing how to build certain decks, but it was helpful knowing that there was a particular ratio of cards that you pretty much had to include if you wanted the deck to be successful. This 20 monster, 10 spells, and 10 traps ratio kept deck building very concise and consistent. This also helped keep me in check every time in the early days, since I remember wanting to go overboard on a certain amount of monster spells or traps, and it made me remember that I had to stick to that ratio. And even if I didn't really know how to build a particular deck, I knew this ratio would help me weed out any dead cards or cards that I just didn't really need. But most importantly, this particular ratio helped create a starting point for when I started to learn the fundamentals of the game. However, bear in mind, you didn't absolutely have to stick to the 20-10-10 ratio. You could absolutely put 12 spells or 12 traps, but you just had to basically make sure they evened out to be 40. So this wasn't absolutely rigid, but it really provided you a strong grounds to where you can start to build a deck in a certain ratio. So you were obviously free to experiment with this sort of deck building ratio, but so long as you didn't stray too far from it. And this brings me to my next point. If you started playing the game since its early inception, it was very common to see other players playing with a mismatch of cards, especially if you were playing with other people at school, who likely had random cards in their deck, and it was just a mismatch of cards altogether. And this ratio really was the greatest antidote to this mismatch of cards that people had from random packs, since it really did help you organize your deck, and it allowed you to efficiently be able to think of a strategy because you now had specific parameters to work with. Although this ratio was the standard in Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck building for a long time, it didn't last forever, and this is no secret if you play modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Modern day decks just don't stick to this format, and it's hard to say when this format specifically went away, but I noticed this ratio had almost completely disappeared by 2014. This has to do with the fact that the game's speed has sped up so much, to where decks are now focused on more combo-centric plays, and this means that they're relying on more spells rather than traps. And traps just eventually became too slow. I've gone into more details about this topic in my video about the fall of trap cards, so feel free to check it out if you haven't already. But while we're on the topic of Yu-Gi-Oh! Becoming more combo-centric, you saw the traditional deck build starting to shift away from the ratio. You started to see more decks use 15 to 18 spell cards, instead of the traditional 10 spells and 10 traps, and you inevitably saw decks use 20 monsters and 20 spells, since spells allowed instant access to resources in general. However, one of the other ways that deck building changed was by shifting more to a draw heavy strategy, and they often involve draw heavy plays. And these draw heavy plays often use cards such as Upstart Goblin, along with One Day of Peace in later years. These cards were often used to dig for resources so that players could execute their combo-centric plays. And there was a huge rush to use these cards in your deck, since the sentiment was that they turned 40 card decks into 39 card decks in a sense, primarily because they increased draw power, along with consistency on your opening turn. Cards like the ones I just mentioned were incredibly popular because of the advantages they gave to particular strategies in the mid-2010s. However, they were inevitably edged out by other strategies that were entering the scene at the time. And search abilities were exactly just that. Search cards/strategies became more preferable since you could precisely seek out the card you wanted, which enabled you to perform your combos a lot more reliably. Search cards weren't like draw cards, because draw cards always posed the possibility that you didn't draw the card that you needed. It was too much uncertainty for combo-centric strategies, which is why cards like Duelist Alliance were far more appealing. Although draw cards still have their place in the meta today, search cards definitely see much more usage in decks. If you pair this with summon heavy effects that special summon from the deck or the grave, this pretty much constitutes the modern day Yu-Gi-Oh strategy that allows us to special summon from our extra deck a lot more effectively. But that pretty much wraps up my thoughts on this topic. And like most of my videos, this is something that I wanted to talk about for a long time, especially that it doesn't get much attention. Initially, I brought this up in a Twitter comment that I made on a post, and this is really something that has been on my mind since then. And this whole card ratio format is something that I wish would come back, since I think it does provide a lot of benefits and stability that helps the game, and it helps many new Yu-Gi-Oh players, or just players in general, in ways that I've mentioned. But it would be cool to have a sort of return to this format, mainly for nostalgia purposes, since this is how I learned the game. But with that, it pretty much wraps it up for this video. If you would like to support more content like this in the future, you can do so at my Necromancer 1040 Patreon link down below. I normally post it in the description, and you can check it there along with the other cool things I normally post down below. And with that, thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for your support, and I'll catch you in the next one. Alright, take care.